Welcome to Wild Side, your wild true crime podcast.
We're your hosts, who are sisters, storytellers, and truth seekers.
I'm Bailey, a therapist who is fascinated by all weird and dark human behaviors.
And I'm Chelsea, an educator here to unearth the facts behind the cases.
We cover true crime because some cases are just too dark to forget,
and others are too wild to ignore.
We're so glad you're here, so buckle up
and enjoy the ride.
What's up, everybody? It's interview week.
Ooh, it's a good one. I mean, we always say that, but it always is a good one.
It always is a good one. And this week we interviewed a wonderful woman named Tamara, and she is a certified sex addiction therapist. I know that I'm a CSAT, but I didn't want to interview me for this. I really wanted to get another professional in the room, and we wanted to dive into the big, broad world of sex addiction.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Chelsea and I had a hard time trying to figure out what case to do with this because it was more of my resistance. I didn't want to do a case where there was, offending behaviors, assault, murder, that kind of thing, because that's not really indicative of sex addiction. And so we ended up going with the potential behaviors of somebody, but who's also the victim in this case.
Yeah, I think it's going to really showcase the duality of sex addiction in a way that maybe some don't realize exists.
Yeah. Now, I want to do a really bold disclaimer here. We are not diagnosing anybody in this case. I am not diagnosing anybody in this case, especially posthumously after their death, with sex addiction. All I am doing is we are going to give you data and information about what sex addiction looks like in a day-to-day thing. These are some of the behaviors that you see commonly associated with it. And so, again, it was kind of a hard thing to narrow in on a case that really fit. But again, it's a topic that I feel very passionately about, and we wanted to cover it. And so here we are.
Yeah.
And so before we dive in, we're going to do a little pop quiz. You guys can answer to yourself in your car. But true or false, Chelsea, most people with sex addiction are men.
I'm going to say true on that one. Okay.
True or false, sex addiction is in the most current revision of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
It has to be. It has to be, right?
Okay. And then true or false, many people with sex addiction or compulsive sexual behavior never offend, but they still lose jobs, marriages, and mental health because of it.
I actually kind of feel like that is false. I think that maybe addiction will lead you to offending behavior.
I don't know if she's just saying that to spice it up, or she literally did not pay any attention to the whole interview of us interviewing this.
I'm saying it to spice it up, Bailey. Gah.
So, a couple of things. Sex addiction is not officially listed in the DSM-5, but the World Health Organization has recognized compulsive sexual behavior disorder in the ICD. And for millions of people, it's not a label, it is real life, and it can be something that feels really out of control.
Yes. So again, I was answering it like I didn't know all the answers to this.
I know.
Because again, like we just did a huge interview. Bailey and I obviously talk about it a bunch, but I do feel like these would be answers that most people would answer. So a survey of over 21,000 people revealed that 91% of those seeking help for sex addiction are in fact male. But anyone, right, any gender, any background can struggle with this. And as far as the spectrum is concerned, it's wide. It's a huge spectrum. So it's hard to pin down.
Yeah. And there are a couple of articles that we put in the references. And it was some really great articles where some of the investigative journalists gave reports from anonymous individuals identifying sex addiction, and they described kind of summaries of what it looks like in their life. And we're just going to read a few to kind of give you guys an idea of like common behaviors. So in one of the articles, there was a woman who was interviewed. Her name was Rebecca Barker. She was a mom of 3. And she describes how her compulsion took over her life, stating, even having sex 5 times a day wasn't enough. It was the first thing I thought about when I woke up. I felt like my whole body was craving it.
Or we have Nick T. Nick ended up throwing out a porn DVD because he felt so much shame, just to turn around and dumpster dive for it at 3:00 in the morning. He also hired a sex worker in Tokyo, but then curled up in a fetal position in terror because it was like, is she going to show up? Is she not going to show up? And both of those outcomes were terrifying for him, right? Like he wanted her to show up, but also didn't want her to show up.
Yeah. And then there's the case of Graham. Over the course of many, many years in his life, he had hired hundreds of sex workers. And one of the things that he says is it's not sexy, right? This whole thing, it's very damaging. It's life destroying. And the cycle, as he puts it, is there's a buildup, there's a high, an act, remorse, and repeat. There's no pleasure left over. It is just about regulation at that point.
Yeah. And that is going to bring us to today's case. And again, as Bailey said, she is not here to diagnose. Come on, guys, I'm not going to be diagnosing, but we just want you guys to understand this very elusive addiction.
Yeah. And to explore what happens when secrecy, pain, and compulsions go unchecked. This is the case of Steve McNair, the fall of a Titan. So hopefully this brings a little less stigma to compulsive sexual behaviors in general. Again, we are not saying that Mr. McNair struggled with it, but his behaviors do closely mimic what you would expect to find in a bell-shaped curve of compulsive sexual behaviors. I also want to give a heartfelt condolence to the McNair family, as one of Steve McNair's brothers actually just passed away in a car accident near Hattiesburg about a month and a half ago. And so, my heart goes out to the family because there's been so much tragedy. And this is going to take us back to Mississippi, where Chelsea and I spent most of our formidable years. So Mount Olive, Mississippi is where we're at. A town so small that you could drive through it in under 5 minutes. But it would end up being the birthplace to one of the greatest football players of his time. On Valentine's Day in 1973, a boy named Steve Latrell McNair was born in the small town of Mount Olive, Mississippi, to Selma and Lucille McNair. Selma and Lucille would go on to have five boys: Fred, Steve, Michael, also known as Doc, who is the one who just passed away, Tim, and Jason. And unfortunately, life wasn't easy from the start within the McNair family. Steve's father, Selma, ended up walking out on the family early on, leaving Lucille all alone to raise 5 boys all by herself in a weathered, rundown home tucked deep in rural Mississippi. But Lucille did everything she could to provide for her sons, clocking in long shifts at the factory just to keep food on the table. But what Lucille lacked in material wealth, she more than made up for in grit and grace. She instilled in her sons the values that don't cost a dime, but carry a family for generations: loyalty, hard work, fairness, and a deep respect for education. The McNair boys grew up close, bound by love for their mother, and an unspoken vow to protect one another at all costs. And while that bond ran really deep, so did their shared love of football.
Now, I don't know if this would come as a surprise to you guys, but hopefully most of you have been exposed to situations like this, and the real father figure when Selma walked out was the oldest, Fred. And Fred was a natural athlete and a steady presence, right? He became the family's anchor, coaching, mentoring, and leading his younger brothers by example. For Steve especially, Fred wasn't just a big brother. He was a guide, someone to show him how to navigate both in life and also in sports with discipline and heart. Steve would go on to reflect on the mentorship with deep gratitude, saying that Fred, quote, gave me a map and showed me how to take the short road, even though he had to take the long one himself. Fred was a strong and present role model for Steve, which likely contributed to Steve's success in life. It was likely due to his close-knit family ties that molded Steve into a quiet, intelligent, and studious man that he would become. Growing up, Steve wasn't one to cause trouble. He listened more than he spoke, and he worked before he played. In the McNair household, the boys knew that their responsibilities came first. Touching a football before finishing chores just flat out was not an option. But once the work was done, football became something sacred to the McNair boys. Steve would go on to follow in Fred's footsteps at first, studying him and imitating him, like all, I think, little brothers do, right? By the time he was getting into high school, Steve made a silent promise to himself. He wouldn't just walk the path Fred carved, he'd make it wider, deeper, and unmistakably his own. And that's just what he did. In a family full of athletic abilities, Steve couldn't help but stand out. He was a naturally gifted athlete with a thirst for greatness that would drive him forward throughout his life. Made of raw power and laser focus, Steve had no shortage of options when it came to pursuing a future in sports. Along with his natural talent and dedication, Steve McNair truly was just blessed with amazing genes. Standing at 6'2", 220 pounds, he was an absolute beast and absolutely dominated in sports. He played baseball, basketball, and football, and of course, was good at all three. As a shortstop and outfielder with a 90-mile-per-hour baseball arm, he earned All-State honors 4 years in a row. On the basketball court, he led from the point guard position. And on the football field, he was absolutely unstoppable. Steve played different positions in football, but as a cornerback, Steve set a new bar, snatching 15 interceptions in a single season and tying the state record with 30 interceptions over his high school career. As a quarterback and only as a junior, Steve led his team at Mount Olive High School to a small school state champion. He was huge. He was fast, and he dominated on the field. You could hear chants of Air McNair, right, under the Friday night lights. A name that was a hand-me-down from his older brother Fred, the original heir in the family. Steve just wanted to make sure that the name soared, and he did. He absolutely did.
I just don't understand how some of these families, we were talking about it in the Pantera case, right? Of how Vinnie Paul and Dimebag Darrell just were like blessed with the genes of music.
Yeah.
Apparently the McNair boys were all blessed with these genes. I think the oldest Fred is currently a coach at Southern University, which is in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. But he was a monster on the field. And these boys were just gifted, right? Just totally gifted. By 1991, professional teams began to take notice of this country boy beast of a dude from rural Mississippi. And we're not talking professionals from just football. Again, because Steve McNair he was grown in a petri dish, I'm convinced. Due to him excelling in baseball alongside football, the Seattle Mariners ended up drafting Steve McNair in the 14th round of the MLB amateur draft. And not to mention, several other colleges extended basketball offers to him. Major programs like LSU, Miami, Ohio State, Nebraska came knocking, but at the time, it just wasn't for the reasons that Steve wanted. They saw Steve McNair as a defensive back, not a quarterback, which was what Steve's heart really wanted. That was his dream. And despite the really tempting offers of MLB and college football, Steve wasn't budging. After long talks with his mother and his brother Fred, Steve ended up making a super bold decision. And it was a decision that many critics thought would be career suicide. He turned it all down. Every scholarship, every scouting opportunity, an MLB contract, everything. He chose a different route, to play quarterback at Alcorn State. Now, Alcorn State University is a historically Black college in Lorman, Mississippi, and it has a really rich legacy in football. But it wasn't just that made it interesting for Steve. It also was the same university that his older brother Fred had once starred under. As a member of the SWAC, which was a conference known for producing legends like Jerry Rice and Walter Payton. And I still think about these names with Dad, right? Because I remember him watching football and he'd talk about Jerry Rice and Walter Payton.
Yeah, absolutely.
Alcorn State had long been a cornerstone of Black college athletics. But still for Steve, choosing a lower tiered school from like a football power standpoint over a powerhouse program came with risks. And the biggest risk was that with Steve choosing ASU over these other prospects, it would dim any hopes of a Heisman run or limit NFL options for him. But for Steve, Alcorn offered two things that he just could not pass up: a guaranteed shot at a quarterback and a campus close to home.
Like, stop.
He's so cute.
How precious is this? And like wise. I feel like that's so wise beyond his years at the time.
Yeah. And I don't think I put it in here, but he ended up getting more offers for like professional leagues before he graduated. And he turned that down too, because he wanted his education. So he stayed to graduate from college before he went off to the NFL, which I think is so admirable, right?
I love it.
So this was good enough for him. He followed his gut and he made the leap and committed to college ball at ASU. And oh boy, did he break records along the way. Over the course of his college career, Steve McNair racked up more than 16,000 total yards. And in his senior season alone, he put up a staggering 6,200 yards, 56 touchdowns, and again dominated the field like no one had ever seen from a small school player. His performance earned him the prestigious Walter Payton Award, and he did something that had never been done before by a player from a program like Alcorn State. He finished third in the Heisman Trophy voting, which is wild. A small town dude making waves in the professional spaces. And this kind of national visibility was unheard of for a player, again, from a smaller school like ASU.
By 1995, after 3 seasons of jaw-dropping performances at Alcorn State, Steve McNair had earned the attention of the NFL. Yes. The Houston Oilers selected him with the 3rd overall pick in the first round of the NFL draft, making him the highest drafted Black quarterback in league history at that time. This wasn't just a personal milestone for McNair. It was a cultural breakthrough. In a league still wrestling with the question of whether Black quarterbacks could lead their team to victory, McNair delivered a powerful reckoning, proving the doubters wrong. He blended toughness and grace, playing through injuries that would sideline most: broken fingers, cracked ribs, battered legs, and still showed up to lead his team week after week. His rise wasn't fast, though, right? Which I think is always kind of makes it the best story. After the draft, the Oilers didn't rush him into play. They wanted him to adjust from Alcorn's simple offense to the complexity of the NFL. But by the time the Oilers moved to Tennessee and became the Titans, McNair not only became the team's quarterback, he would go on to essentially become the team's identity. By 1999, McNair had led the Titans to their first ever Super Bowl appearance, and it was a legendary season. The Titans were undefeated at home, and in the playoffs, they pulled off one of the most iconic plays in NFL history, the Music City Miracle, a last-second lateral return for a touchdown that stunned the world, propelling the Titans to the championship game. The world at the time was full of McNair jerseys and kids boasting "Air McNair" signs, showing their love for their hero. But despite Steve's incredible performance, unfortunately, the Titans lost in the final moments of the Super Bowl, 1 yard short of victory.
Now, Steve McNair may not have won a Super Bowl, but he did not need a ring to prove his greatness. In 2003, he was named co-MVP of the NFL, sharing the honor with Peyton Manning. Fun fact, even though Peyton Manning didn't go to a Mississippi college, his little brother Eli went to the University of Mississippi, and Brett Favre went to Chelsea's and my alma mater, and he went to our high school, just so you guys know, because football's a real big deal in Mississippi.
I think Mississippi is just one of those weird, magical places. I mean, it produces like the most amazing writers, amazing football players. I don't know.
I mean, you ain't got shit
Maybe
else to
it's this
do.
drive of like wanting to get out. Like, we got to do something instead of Mississippi.
Well, yeah, because like the whole state is rural. Anyways, over 13 grueling seasons with the NFL, Steve McNair earned 3 Pro Bowl selections and left a legacy so deep that when he retired, the Titans retired his iconic number 9. But what made Steve McNair unforgettable wasn't what he did on the field. It was who he was off of it. In the years leading up to his retirement, Steve was known not just for his athletic prowess, but his commitment to giving back to his community, which Chelsea and I, we love that kind of stuff. He gave back quietly and consistently, hosting youth camps, launching his own foundation, and raising funds for victims of Hurricane Katrina, which we were victims of Hurricane Katrina. Didn't know that. So thank you, Steve McNair. One of his last philanthropic efforts was the opening of Gridiron 9, a restaurant on Jefferson Street in Nashville that was designed to provide affordable meals to Tennessee State University students. It, again, was just another layer of the man that the public admired. He was always striving to make a difference and always trying to give back. Steve McNair didn't just wear the jersey, he wore the responsibility that came with it. He was basically America's sweetheart, not because he sought the spotlight, but because he never let it change him. He was humble, approachable, and never carried himself like the superstar that he really was. And it honestly made him relatable. It made him heroic. But unfortunately, this is the thing about icons. We love them when they're strong and look away when they start to bleed. We let them carry the weight until it crushes them because we like our heroes invincible. Steve McNair was a man. He was not a machine. And he was a man carrying pressure, pain, and expectations that few can really fathom. And behind the touchdowns, the trophies, and the cheers, he was in pain. And that pain didn't disappear when the games ended. It followed him all the way home.
By the mid-2000s, Steve McNair's life appeared to be everything the world could envy. To the world, Steve McNair was a committed father, a generous figure, a community hero, right? He was a father of 4. He had 2 sons from his previous relationship, Stephen L. McNair Jr. and Stephen O'Brien Corin McNair, whom he had taken full legal and emotional responsibility for after leaving Alcorn State. With his wife, Michelle, whom he married in 1997, He had two more sons, Tyler James and Trenton John. Michelle, a registered nurse, was composed, private, and fiercely protective of her family. While Steve was a football legend and a well-known community figure, Michelle's life unfolded quietly behind closed doors, focused on family and keeping their world stable. But beneath the polished exterior, the cracks in their seemingly perfect life were starting to show. Unknown to those who adored McNair, the football icon who had spent years in the spotlight, well, he was living a life full of secrets. Secrets that were soon to unravel in ways no one could have ever predicted. Steve, who had once been tough as nails, found himself overwhelmed, often showing up to practice medicated or hungover, brushing it off with a casual, like, yeah, I'll get it together, right? But the harder Steve tried to, quote, get it together, the further the quicksand pulled him down. By the time Steve retired in 2008, he was 36, past his prime, and really just unprepared for the emotional vacuum that would follow. His body, ravaged by injuries like bone spurs and a cracked sternum, showed the toll years of playing had taken. There was no getting it together, really. Instead, after retiring, Steve had built a sprawling empire of properties in Nashville, including a downtown condo. Here he found himself spending more and more time in his Nashville condo, not as a sanctuary, really, but more as a hideout, a place to mask the truth, even from himself. It was there, far from his family, where he entertained friends and, as time would reveal, other women, mistresses. This growing divide in Steve's life wasn't confined to his secret relationships and the multiple women. At home, despite knowing about her husband's affairs, Michelle had chosen to remain silent, as many partners do. That's pretty normal. She had learned to live with the whispers, avoiding digging too deep to find the truth. Michelle and Steve's lives had become divided. Steve constantly on the road, and although affectionate when home, the emotional distance between the two was palpable. While Michelle managed the household and their children, Steve handled everything else, everything that was becoming increasingly hard to carry.
You know, when I worked at Gentle Path, the inpatient all-male sex addiction facility, we treated kind of the one percenters of the world. There was professional athletes, there was high executives in all the industries, right? And I've worked with several professional athletes, and one of the things that I see is this kind of loss after career peak, whether that's retirement, injury, what have you. I want to do a quick shout out, and we're going to put it in our summary notes. There's a friend of mine from high school, and her name is Amanda Leachman, and she's pretty awesome. She was pretty amazing with gymnastics in school. She trained us for gymnastics, and then when she stopped, she had a really, really, really hard time. And so she created the Athlete Identity Project, and it is athleteidentityproject.co. You guys should really check it out. But the whole purpose of this is providing athlete support when the game stops, which I think is so amazing.
I love that. It's and very much, I think, like underrated.
Oh,
right? Because
yeah.
I mean, people always talk about peaking in high school, right? I mean, it's essentially like a forced peak. Even if you don't mean to peak earlier in your life, things like being front and center do cause that, right?
Yeah. So if any athletes out there who, still struggle with what life after, your athleticism peaks, then she has a great program, and big shout out. And so, kind of getting back into the case, though the NFL does offer resources to its players to manage personal lives, money, like money management tips, help, support, media training, retirement planning, all of that stuff, all too often the emotional aspects of their lives, of their players, are neglected. And arguably, this was a part of Steve's life that haunted him. Now, this is just through my own personal clinical lens. This doesn't mean I'm correct. It's just me thinking out loud. In Steve McNair's case, these emotional gaps may have played a really big role in behaviors that contribute to, chronic affairs and stuff like that, right? These patterns of infidelity, secrecy around relationships, and the emotional compartmentalization that he often exhibited fit the profile of someone possibly struggling with compulsive sexual behavior. Often we see with these behaviors, we often see a need for validation, the urge to escape from deeper emotional pain, and the desire for control that can manifest through these patterns in their relationships. With Steve's upbringing and experiences, it could have been foundational in shaping this behavior. I mean, growing up in a challenging environment, I think growing up in rural Mississippi is pretty challenging in lots of ways. And not to mention, not just the Mississippi piece, but performance wasn't just encouraged, but it was expected. As for these boys, I think there was probably a lot of pressure of like pulling their family out of poverty or lower socioeconomic status by their success with football, right? And what this can do, again, from my experience working with not just humans, but professional athletes, it could have taught Steve that emotional vulnerability wasn't safe. Like, I know what to do on the field. I know what to do with my body. I know what to do with my limitations here, but that other kind of side to the coin maybe wasn't really addressed. The physical ability, his success on the football field, gave him a sense of control. But emotionally, perhaps, especially after retiring, he felt unprepared to manage the complexity of relationships or his own needs for intimacy. This disconnect could have contributed to him seeking solace in multiple relationships, rather than confronting the emotional void that he felt when he retired. And kind of, in that same vein, the demanding nature of a professional athlete, the constant travel, the pressure to perform at an elite level may have added gasoline to the fire, right? Athletes, especially those who are constantly in the public eye, are often conditioned to express vulnerability in favor of maintaining a strong, dominant persona. This external pressure, coupled with the emotional neglect that athletes usually experience, could have created a perfect storm where sex or acting out became a coping mechanism, a maladaptive coping mechanism, a way for, in this case, perhaps to soothe this internal turmoil, escaping from his reality and fulfilling a need for connection that he couldn't find in like a healthier or sustainable way. As many people who struggle with compulsive behaviors, it's likely that Steve's actions were not solely about the act itself, but again, about avoiding the deep emotional pain. Sex, in this context, could have become a way to regulate his emotions, to fill the emotional gaps he was unwilling or unable to face, depending on the circumstances. His pattern of seeking out multiple women, keeping his affairs secret, and distancing himself emotionally from his wife and family are all hallmark indicators that we commonly see with individuals who struggle with this area. And again, driven by a deeper need to avoid confronting unresolved issues from the past.
Now, shortly after retiring, at the beginning of 2009, Steve began an affair with a 19-year-old waitress by the name of Sahel Jenni Kazemi. The two had met while she was working at a local Dave & Buster's, which was a popular hangout spot for many of the Tennessee Titan football players. By the time she met Steve, Jenni had already faced a lifetime of hardship. Jenni had immigrated to the United States from Iran as a teenager after a devastating tragedy. Her mother had been murdered there in Iran. At just 16 years old, Jenni moved from Florida to Tennessee with a boyfriend, but by the end of 2008, they had parted ways. That was where she met Steve McNair, a man who seemed to promise her everything she had ever longed for: wealth, stability, and a way out of the struggles that had defined her life. Their relationship quickly grew serious. Steve, now retired and already building a reputation as a philanthropist, began spending more time with Jenni at his downtown Nashville condo he rented with a friend, a place to escape his family and live a double life. The two quickly became inseparable, traveling together, visiting places in Florida, California, and Hawaii. Steve McNair even took Jenni to his farm in Mississippi, and for her 20th birthday in May 2009, he co-signed a luxury Cadillac Escalade for her, a symbol of the life she thought they were building together. When her family came to Nashville to celebrate, they dined with McNair at a sushi restaurant and partied at local clubs. It seemed that Jenni was very happy and planning to move in with Steve McNair. She thought he was in the final stages of a divorce from his wife of 12 years, and everything seemed perfect. She believed in her heart that the famous Steve Air McNair loved her and that they were close to living happily ever after. All the things that soothed the fear of abandonment that was such a strong pull in her aching heart from years of trauma. But that, unfortunately, like we see so often, that was just a fantasy that Jenni had created, whether in part from her own assumptions or from the love-bombing tendencies that accompanies affairs. But regardless, and unbeknownst to Jenni, it was a fantasy that Steve had been living with not just her, but with other women as well. Steve had several other romantic relationships with other women at the same time he was seeing Jenni, all while keeping up the appearance of his other life of being a loving husband and father to his family back home.
By July of 2009, Steve McNair and Jenni had been secretly dating for about 6 months. The relationship was about to face a really dark turn. Jenni had discovered evidence suggesting that her knight in shining armor, Steve, was also involved with another woman after finding used condoms in the bathroom of his condo. Now, as a side note, we are going to be dropping an interview of betrayal trauma the interview week after this week. So it's going to be two kind of cases side by side that's going to really kind of look at these dynamics.
Yeah. Y'all are in the middle of a trauma sandwich.
Yes. Steve, as only a few in his close circles knew, he was having an affair with Leah Ignagni, a woman he had met several months prior. Leah was aware of Jenni and reported that she had noticed a Cadillac Escalade following her on several occasions, which obviously indicates that Jenni might have been kind of keeping tabs, following, stalking, whatever behavior you want to kind of say, whatever words. At this point, Jenni had found out, and it had absolutely popped her fantasy bubble that was keeping her going. As the relationship between Steve and Jenni continued, tensions kept rising. Steve was becoming increasingly annoyed by his relationship with Jenni. She had started calling him at inconvenient times when he was with his wife and kids, which prompted Steve to start creating distance, seeing Jenni less and less frequently. Now, as Chelsea said earlier, Jenni had already faced so much hardship in her life. Losing both of her parents, immigrating from her home country of origin, dropping out of school to support her family. But now we start seeing the beginnings of a complete unravel. For Steve, compartmentalizing these relationships had been manageable. That's how he managed it. But for Jenni, it likely was unbearable betrayal. As her emotional attachment to Steve deepened, so reportedly did her instability. Now, there's a lot of mixed reports. Some people say not so much, some people say yes so much, and it's all out there for you to kind of take a gander at. But arguably, her jealousy and paranoia grew as she began to suspect that the fantasy she so desperately clung to was in fact slowly deteriorating.
When I think of relationships like these, and I don't know if they even make them anymore, but when we were growing up, they would have those little finger traps,
Oh,
right?
those Chinese finger traps? Yeah.
Yeah. So you would stick your fingers in either end, and as you pulled, the harder you pulled away, the more that this little contraption tightened down around your fingers, right? And that's always the visual I get listening to relationships like this, right? Like, so the harder that Steve is trying to pull away, the more that Jenni is just clamping, right? Just clamping down.
You know what's so interesting about that, just kind of as a side note, I know I'm kind of nerding out through this episode, but that literally is the tangible explanation of a clinical theory that's called the LALA cycle, and it stands for love avoidance, love addiction cycle. You guys can Google it. It's PIA melody, PIA melody. And it literally depicts that. You have this cycle for fear of or love addiction, and then you have this cycle for love avoidant, and they like push and pull off of each other. So it's literally exactly what you're talking about. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Now, I think you guys are understanding the picture that we're trying to paint. And now we've arrived at the night of July 1st, 2009, and this has officially reached a tipping point. Steve met Jenni at a sports bar after Leah had left. Jenni, Steve, and one of Steve's friends, Vent Casper Gordon, ended up leaving the sports bar with Jenni driving the Escalade. Some short time later, the trio was pulled over by the police, and Jenni was arrested for DUI. Steve McNair and Gordon were allowed to leave the scene in a cab. When questioned by officers, Jenni revealed that Steve was her boyfriend, but added that, quote, he's married. Now, hindsight is always 20/20, and it was this moment that seemed to bring forth chilling clarity that wasn't so clear at the time. A profound moment that likely spoke to Jenni's illusion of a future with Steve that was crumbling. Hours later, Steve ended up bailing Jenni out of jail, and the two reportedly argued. After parting ways, Steve went to see his other woman, Leah, before heading to work at his restaurant. The next day, Steve and Jenni exchanged texts while he was fishing with his sons. Jenni expressed concern about her mounting financial struggles, her cell phone and hospital bills, the sudden increase in rent after her roommate moved out, and car payments on the Escalade. Steve McNair agreed to transfer $2,000 to her, but Jenni remained upset, even suggesting that she might go to the hospital for a checkup. These last series of events were likely the straw that broke the camel's back. In her world's view, the promises that Steve McNair had made were fading, and with them, her ability to cope. With her world collapsing, she had had enough.
Now, I think it's really important here to really speak to some of this dynamic. Jenni's identity at this point had become so intertwined with Steve that arguably she could no longer see herself or her life without him. And when his promises began to fade and his actions no longer matched his words, I imagine, this is just speculation on my part, but I imagine that her fear of abandonment really started to become pretty suffocating. The emotional storm that Jenni was facing, marked by financial strain, trauma, and of course the crumbling of the dream that she had built around Steve, really started to push her towards a breaking point. Her attachment to him had become all-consuming, and when she feared that the life she had imagined with him was slipping away, she just really couldn't handle it. Steve McNair's double life, filled with secrets, lies, and hidden relationships, came to a violent and heartbreaking end. And with it, the fantasy that Jenni had clung to for so long was shattered forever.
The night after Jenni was arrested for DUI, Jenni's manager at Dave & Buster's, Sonia New, noticed a shift in her behavior. Jenni, who was typically upbeat, seemed rather distracted and unusually downcast. She confided in Sonia about her relationship with Steve and the DUI arrest, even going as far to say, "My life is just crap, and I should end it." That same evening, Jenni ended up purchasing a 9mm semi-automatic pistol for $100 from Adrian Gilliam, a convicted felon she had met while trying to sell her car. The two met in the parking lot of the mall where she worked, and it was there that she bought the gun. It was likely a desperate, impulsive decision that would prove to be the turning point in her unraveling emotional state, a manifestation of her spiraling mind. When the man who sold it to her asked why she needed it, she simply said she needed protection. But in reality, this wasn't just about safety. This was about a desperate plea for control and a life spiraling out of her grasp. Jenni's emotional fragility became painfully clear to those around her. Roommates described her as, again, distracted, anxious, and obsessively fixated on Steve. She was consumed by the fear of losing him, not just out of love, but also likely because of stability, the sense of safety and protection.
Now, this arguably was a tipping point. In the field of suicide prevention, we recognize a dangerous combination, a sense of what we call perceived burdenness, or feeling like a burden, and overwhelming hopelessness. When a person feels trapped, unable to see a way out, usually their emotional turmoil can really start to spiral into something pretty dangerous, not just to themselves, but sometimes to other people. And in this case, Jenni's actions really fit that classic pre-suicidal profile: impulsivity, erratic emotion, and decisions made in a haze of despair. Her identity had become inextricably tied to Steve and to the life she believed she was promised. And when that relationship, arguably her only real anchor, was threatened, she didn't break down logically. Arguably, it was a pretty irrational break. The whirlwind that followed probably clouded her judgment and led her down a path that she just couldn't turn away from, or decided not to turn away from. In the space of 2 days, Jenni's world had shattered. Essentially, she got a speeding ticket, the DUI arrest, and purchased a gun, and these just weren't isolated incidents. Again, it was just the symptoms to a bigger issue that was going on. Her emotional state had tipped into something dark and probably, as we will see, something irreversible. And when someone's sense of self is so wrapped up in a relationship, the stakes are really, really, really high. Jenni's response was a dangerous, desperate attempt to hold on to the only thing that made her feel alive. But in her chaos, she was going to risk losing everything.
It was the early hours of July 4th, 2009, when Jenni decided to take matters into her own hands. After her shift ended, she texted Steve McNair, inviting him out for drinks. He declined, telling her he was busy with his children. But Jenni, feeling persistent, chose to go to McNair's condo anyway, despite his earlier rejection. Meanwhile, Steve, out with a friend at a bar, eventually decided to head home. Around 12:38 a.m., he sent Jenni a text letting her know he was on his way, and it wasn't long before he arrived at the condo, sometime between 1:15 and 1:30 a.m. Little did anyone know the hours ahead would end in tragedy. By early afternoon, tragedy struck. At around 12:40 p.m., Wayne Neely, McNair's friend and condo mate, arrived at the condo. As he entered, he made a chilling discovery. Two bodies lying lifeless in the condo. But shockingly, Neely didn't recognize them immediately. It wasn't until moments later when he reached out to McNair's business partner, Robert Gaddy, who rushed to the scene. Upon arriving, Gaddy immediately recognized McNair's body. At 1:35 p.m., he stepped outside to call 911. What investigators would soon confirm was nothing short of horrific. It was ruled a murder-suicide. The details were devastating. Sometime in the early hours of July 4th, McNair had fallen asleep on the couch, unaware of what was about to happen. Jenni, in a moment of shocking violence, shot him multiple times while he lay sleeping. From just a few feet away, she shot him in the left side of his head. Then she shot him twice in the chest before finally shooting him at close range in the right side of his head. Afterward, in an eerie final act, Jenni sat beside McNair, and with a single shot, she took her own life. The bullet struck the right side of her head, and she collapsed onto his lap. She eventually fell to the floor, lying on top of the gun. The chilling scene would remain undisturbed until the following day, when it was discovered by McNair's friend, Wayne Neely. A life full of secrets had tragically ended, leaving behind a mystery no one could have anticipated.
Now, while law enforcement was initially really confident in the ruling of the deaths of Steve McNair and Jenni Kazemi that it was a murder-suicide, doubts soon began to surface. Those who knew Jenni in the weeks leading up to the tragic event struggled to reconcile the woman they knew with the violent act authorities were suggesting. Jenni's family and friends insisted that she had never shown signs of emotional instability or financial distress. In fact, Tim Rohan, the host of the Steve McNair Fall of a Titan podcast, interviewed those closest to Jenni, and they reported that she wasn't particularly upset by Steve's infidelities or the DUI incident, that she wasn't struggling financially as the investigators had claimed. These discrepancies raised questions about the official story, and as more details emerged, it became clear that there were more layers to this case than authorities initially suggested. The murder and suicide, arguably, of Steve McNair and Jenni Kazemi grew even more complicated after the involvement of Adrian Gilliam. Remember, the dude who sold Jenni the gun that was used in the murder-suicide. Gilliam had initially lied to police about his relationship with Jenni, claiming he didn't even know the name. But investigators later discovered that he had made over 200 calls and texts to her in the weeks leading up to the deaths. His changing story about his whereabouts during the time of the shooting and the fact that he was the last person to be in contact with Jenni on the day of her death raised further suspicions. Vincent Hill, who was a private investigator and had written extensively about the case, made the argument that there were critical gaps in the investigation's findings. In an appearance on the Untold documentary series, Hill pointed out that once the public starts to see the holes in the case, they would be compelled to question what really happened. Hill speculated that Gilliam might have been involved in more than just selling Jenni the gun, going as far as suggesting that there could have been a connection between the events at Steve McNair's business partner, Robert Gaddy. Detective Charles Robinson, in the same documentary, revealed that Gaddy had a falling out with McNair over a $13,000 debt. However, Gaddy vehemently denied any involvement in Steve's death, responding to Hill's claims by saying, "You think I'm involved in my best friend's murder over $13,000?" Gaddy explained the deep regret he felt for the argument he had with McNair, wishing that he had been there and thinking that if he had, things may have been different.
But Hill's allegations didn't sit well with others. Nashville Detective Robinson dismissed Hill's claims, pointing to Hill's lack of experience with homicide investigations. "Ask him for his resume," Robinson challenged. "How many murders did you work on at the police department?" 0. McNair's former head coach, Jeff Fisher, also weighing in, saying, "I could make a case that things don't add up. I don't want to speculate. Let's just let it go." While McNair's funeral was broadcasted live for the world to see, attended by thousands who mourned the loss of a hero, Jenni's story quickly faded into the background. She was painted as unstable and dangerous, but very few took the time to ask why. Few examined the deeper, more complex forces that led both her and Steve McNair to that tragic day. Steve McNair was beloved by so many, a hero both on and off the field. But the truth is, McNair was not just a hero, he was a man, with all the complexities, flaws, and shadows that come with being human. He lived a dual life, balancing his public persona with the private struggles he kept hidden from the world. And Jenni, she got lost in the gap between those lives. She was caught between the man McNair showed the world and the man she thought she knew. It's a story that's both heartbreaking and profoundly human. It's really a story about the complexity of human relationships, the unseen pain that many try to bury, and the dangerous consequences of failing to confront those shadows. That's what makes this story so relatable and yet so tragic. It's a story about the gaps between who we are, who we show the world, and who we are when no one is watching. And in those gaps, sometimes people get lost.
You know, this case is so sad for me. Again, we talked about interview with Tamara, who is a CSAT, and explained that compulsive sexual behavior is often a way to regulate overwhelming emotions. Relationship addiction is a real thing too, becoming so addicted to another human being. For many, it becomes, again, a coping mechanism, a way to numb the pain when other emotions feel too much to bear. In a culture that tells especially men not to feel and women to attach for safety, this creates a perfect storm where unhealthy behaviors can thrive, sometimes with devastating consequences. You know, as a therapist, especially as an addiction, a trauma, a sex addiction therapist, we often see the toll that untreated pain can take. Sometimes it manifests as compulsive behavior, sometimes as an addiction. In this case, it looks like a man who could orchestrate a game-winning Super Bowl drive, but couldn't sit alone with his own emotions. Steve McNair's life, it seems, was full of moments of triumph. Yet in the quiet spaces between those moments, he struggled to confront the shadows that lingered.
You know, I feel like in the field of true crime, right, in the genre of true crime, there are often what seems to be a hero and a villain, right? And I think society wants to have a nice box where a hero fits in and a villain fits in. But I don't believe that this story has a villain. I believe that this story has two people that were shaped by systems that taught them to perform, to hide, and I think, just from my perspective, to suffer in silence.
Now, I'm sure that sounds maybe even a little offensive to people when we say, like, this victim does, or this story doesn't have a victim. I think it does and it doesn't, right? Or
it doesn't have
a villain. Yes, you're correct. And maybe my brain's going down the victim route, because in this story, I really do think that there are kind of innumerable victims here. So obviously you have Steve McNair, who is a victim of a homicide, right? Like that's not debatable.
Right.
And I think a lot of us can agree that your behavior, even though if it's not on par with a moral high road, that doesn't mean you're worthy of being killed, right? So despite
Correct.
his acting out behaviors, despite his infidelity, I do not believe that he deserved what he got. Then you also have the victim of Jenni, right? So if he was dishonest about their relationship, right, and his fidelity, then she was a victim of that. And then I think the super overlooked people in this case is Michelle, right? Steve's wife and his 4 boys, right? So not only are now they victims of their husband and their dad's betrayal, but they are victims of society's gawking, right? The rumors and the, throwing their loved one's name through the mud. And this is why Chelsea and I chose this case, is because, again, it points out how, in my experience, when I work with addiction, and in this specific case, sex addiction, it's not gross monsters hiding under stairs. They're usually very successful men with families, right? And in this specific case, I think it was a lot of unresolved pain that collided to create kind of a perfect storm. I think, like we always say, it was a tragedy that could have been prevented, but it also can be arguably a case that gives us a little bit of education on what we can look for moving forward.
Sure. Absolutely. And I think really what Bailey and I hope that you guys get from this case in our interview with Tamara is, like, I think is a running theme, right? With Wildside, people do monstrous things. People have monstrous characteristics, monstrous flaws even. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are monsters, right? People who struggle with sex addiction, yes, they do despicable things even. We could use that word, despicable. But again, like Bailey said, it doesn't mean that they deserve to be the result of a homicide.
No.
As always, if you or someone you know is struggling with any form of compulsive behavior, emotional trauma, or thoughts of harm, please reach out for help. We talk about this extensively in our interview, and I hope you've heard it here. There are people who not only can help, but people who sincerely love helping those situations.
Yeah, for sure.
And hopefully, this will be a nudge for you if you're in that boat and if you're having some unresolved issues. And as always, we have resources that are linked in our show notes.
Yeah. And so we hope that you guys liked this episode. If it resonated with you, share it, leave a review. We welcome feedback. And again, a huge shout out, much love to, the extended McNair family, Jenni's family, Michelle's family even. This is just a painful, awful, horrible thing that happened to probably really good human beings, right? That got caught up. So, as always, you guys, thanks for hanging out with us through this wild and crazy ride. And we'll catch you guys on the wild side. Bye,
Later,
guys.
Gators.